On the night of 2021 August 1968, the Soviet Union and its main allies in the Warsaw Pact, Bulgaria, Hungary, East Germany, and Poland, invaded the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic in order to halt Alexander Dubček's Prague Spring political liberalization reforms. In the operation, codenamed Danube, approximately 500,000 troops, with Romania and Albania refusing to participate, attacked Czechoslovakia. 108 Czechs and Slovaks were killed and around 500 wounded in the invasion. The invasion successfully stopped the liberalization reforms and strengthened the authority of the authoritarian wing within the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. The foreign policy of the Soviet Union during this era was known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Soviet fears. Leonid Brezhnev and the leadership of the Warsaw Pact countries were worried that the unfolding liberalizations in Czechoslovakia, including the ending of censorship and political surveillance by the secret police, would be detrimental to their interests. The first such fear was that Czechoslovakia would defect from the bloc, injuring the Soviet Union's position in a possible war with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Not only would a loss result in a lack of strategic depth for the USSR, but it would also mean that it could not tap Czechoslovakia's industrial base in a potential war. Czechoslovak leaders had no intention of leaving the Warsaw Pact, but Moscow felt it could not be certain exactly what Prague's intentions were. Other fears included the spread of liberalization and unrest elsewhere in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact countries feared that if the Prague Spring reforms went unchecked, then those ideals might very well spread to Poland and East Germany, upsetting the status quo there as well. Within the Soviet Union, nationalism in the republics of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine was already causing problems, and many were worried that events in Prague might exacerbate those problems. KGB chairman Yuri Andropov and Ukrainian leaders Petro Shelist and Nikolai Podgorny were the most vehement proponents of military intervention. In addition, part of Czechoslovakia bordered Austria and West Germany, which were on the other side of the Iron Curtain. This meant both that foreign agents could potentially slip into Czechoslovakia and into any member of the communist bloc, and that defectors could slip out to the West. The final concern emerged directly from the lack of censorship. Writers whose work had been censored in the Soviet Union could simply go to Prague or Bratislava and air their grievances there, circumventing the Soviet Union's censorship. Czechoslovak negotiations with the USSR and other Warsaw Pact states. The Soviet leadership at first tried to stop or limit the impact of Dubček's initiatives through a series of negotiations. Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union agreed to bilateral talks to be held in July 1968 at Siena nad Tisou, near the Slovak-Soviet border. At the meeting, with attendance of Brezhnev, Alexei Kosygin, Nikolai Podgorny, Mikhail Suslov and others on the Soviet side, and Dubček, Ludvík Svoboda, Oldřich Cernik, Josef Smirkovsky and others on the Czechoslovak side. Dubček defended the program of the reformist wing of the KSC while pledging commitment to the Warsaw Pact and Kumkan. The KSC leadership, however, was divided between vigorous reformers who supported Dubček, and conservatives who adopted an anti-reformist stance. Brezhnev decided on compromise. The KSC delegates reaffirmed their loyalty to the Warsaw Pact and promised to curb anti-socialist tendencies, prevent the revival of the Czechoslovak Social Democratic Party, and control the press more effectively. The USSR agreed to withdraw their troops and permit the 9th of September Party Congress. On 3 August, representatives from the Soviet Union, East Germany, People's Republic of Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia met in Bratislava and signed the Bratislava Declaration. The declaration affirmed unshakable fidelity to Marxism-Leninism and proletarian internationalism and declared an implacable struggle against bourgeois ideology and all anti-socialist forces. The Soviet Union expressed its intention to intervene in a Warsaw Pact country if a bourgeois system, a pluralist system of several political parties, representing different factions of the capitalist class, was ever established. After the Bratislava Conference, Soviet troops left Czechoslovak territory but remained along Czechoslovak borders. As these talks proved unsatisfactory, the USSR began to consider a military alternative. The Soviet Union's policy of compelling the socialist governments of its satellite states to subordinate their national interests to those of the Eastern Bloc became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. NATO. The United States and NATO largely turned a blind eye to the evolving situation in Czechoslovakia. While the Soviet Union was worried that it might lose an ally, the United States had absolutely no desire to gain it. President Lyndon Johnson had already involved the United States in the Vietnam War and was unlikely to be able to drum up support for a potential conflict in Czechoslovakia. Also, he wanted to pursue an arms control treaty with the Soviets. SALT. He needed a willing partner in Moscow in order to reach such an agreement, and he did not wish to potentially risk that treaty for Czechoslovakia. For these reasons, the United States made it clear that it would not intervene on behalf of the Prague Spring, giving the USSR a free hand to do as it pleased. Intervention. At approximately 11 p.m. on the 20th of August 1968, Eastern Bloc armies from 4 Warsaw Pact countries, the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Poland and Hungary, invaded Czechoslovakia. That night, 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops and 2,000 tanks entered the country. Romania did not take part in the invasion, and nor did Albania, which withdrew from the Warsaw Pact over the matter. Participation of the German Democratic Republic was cancelled just hours before the invasion. The invasion was well planned and coordinated, simultaneously with the border crossing by ground forces. A Soviet airborne division captured Prague-Václav Havel Airport in the early hours of the invasion. It began with a special flight from Moscow which carried more than 100 plainclothes agents. They quickly secured the airport and prepared the way for the huge forthcoming airlift, in which 12 transport aircraft began arriving and unloading Soviet airborne troops equipped with artillery and light tanks. As the operation at the airport continued, columns of tanks and motorized rifle troops headed toward Prague and other major centers, meeting no resistance. The bulk of the invading forces were from the Soviet Union, supported by other countries from the Communist bloc. Among them were 28,000 troops of the Polish Second Army from the Silesian military district, commanded by General Florian Siwicki. And all invading Hungarian troops were withdrawn by the 31st of October. During the attack of the Warsaw Pact armies, 72 Czechs and Slovaks were killed and hundreds were wounded. Alexander Dubček called upon his people not to resist. He was arrested and taken to Moscow along with several of his colleagues. Dubček and most of the reformers were returned to Prague on the 27th of August. And Dubček retained his post as the party's first secretary until he was forced to resign in April 1969 following the Czechoslovak hockey riots. The invasion was followed by a wave of emigration, largely of highly qualified people, unseen before, and stopped shortly after. Western countries allowed these people to immigrate without complications. Failure to prepare. The Dubček regime took no steps to forestall a potential invasion, despite the ominous troop movements by the Warsaw Pact. The Czechoslovak leadership believed that the Soviet Union and its allies would not invade, having believed that the summit at Siena nad Tisou had smoothed out the differences between the two sides. They also believed that any invasion would be too costly. both because of domestic support for the reforms and because the international political outcry would be too significant, especially with the World Communist Conference coming up in November of that year. Czechoslovakia could have raised the costs of such an invasion by drumming up international support or making military preparations such as blocking roads and ramping up security of their airports. But they decided not to, paving the way for the invasion. Letter of invitation. Although on the night of the invasion, the Czechoslovak Presidium declared that Warsaw Pact troops had crossed the border without knowledge of the CSSR government, the Soviet press printed an unsigned request, allegedly by Czechoslovak party and state leaders, for immediate assistance, including assistance with armed forces. At the 14th KSC Party Congress, it was emphasized that no member of the leadership had invited the intervention. At the time, a number of commentators believed the letter was fake or non-existent. In the early 1990s, however, the Russian government gave the new Czechoslovak president, Václav Havel, a copy of a letter of invitation addressed to Soviet authorities and signed by KSC members Bilek, Svestka, Kolder, Indra, and Karpake. It claimed that right-wing media were fomenting a wave of nationalism and chauvinism, and provoking an anti-communist and anti-Soviet psychosis. It formally asked the Soviets to lend support and assistance with all means at your disposal to save the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic from the imminent danger of counter-revolution. A 1992 Izvestia article claimed that candidate Presidium member Antonin Karpake gave Leonid Brezhnev a letter at the Soviet Czechoslovak Siena nad Tizou talks in late July which appealed for fraternal help. A second letter was supposedly delivered by Bilek to Ukrainian party leader Petro Shelist during the August Bratislava conference, in a lavatory rendezvous arranged through the KGB station chief. This letter was signed by the same five as Karpake's letter, mentioned above. Internal plot. Long before the invasion, planning for a coup was undertaken by Indra, Kolder, and Bilek, among others, often at the Soviet embassy and at the party recreation center at Orlik Dam. When these men had managed to convince a majority of the Presidium to side with them against Alexander Dubček's reformists, they asked the USSR to launch a military invasion. The USSR leadership was even considering waiting until the 26th of August Slovak Party Congress. But the Czechoslovak conspirators specifically requested the night of the 20th. The plan was to unfold as follows. A debate would unfold in response to the Kasper report on the state of the country, during which conservative members would insist that Dubček present two letters he had received from the USSR, letters which listed promises he had made at the Siena nad Tizou talks but had failed to keep. Dubček's concealment of such important letters, and his unwillingness to keep his promises would lead to a vote of confidence which the now conservative majority would win, seizing power, and issue a request for Soviet assistance in preventing a counter-revolution. It was this formal request drafted in Moscow, which was published in Pravda on the 22nd of August without the signatories. All the USSR needed to do was suppress the Czechoslovak military and any violent resistance. With this plan in mind, the 16-17 August Soviet Politburo meeting passed a resolution to provide help to the Communist Party and people of Czechoslovakia through military force. At the 18th of August Warsaw Pact meeting, Brezhnev announced that the intervention would go ahead on the night of the 20th of August, and asked for fraternal support, which the national leaders of Bulgaria, East Germany, Hungary, and Poland duly offered. Failure of the plot. The coup, however, did not go according to plan. Kolder intended to review the Kasper report early in the meeting, but Dubček and Spacek, suspicious of Kolder, adjusted the agenda so the upcoming 14th Party Congress could be covered before any discussion on recent reforms or Kasper's report. Discussion of the Congress dragged on, and before the conspirators had a chance to request a confidence vote, Early news of the invasion reached the Presidium. An anonymous warning was transmitted by the Czechoslovak ambassador to Hungary, Joseph Puick, approximately 6 hours before Soviet troops crossed the border at midnight. When the news arrived, the solidarity of conservative coalition crumbled. When the Presidium proposed a declaration condemning the invasion, two key members of the conspiracy, Jan Piller and František Barbarek, switched sides to support Dubček. With their help, declaration against the invasion won with a 7-4 majority. Moscow Protocol. By the morning of the 21st of August, Dubček and other prominent reformists had been arrested and were later flown to Moscow. There they were held in secret and interrogated for days. The conservatives asked Svoboda to create an emergency government, but since they had not won a clear majority of support, he refused. Instead, he and Gustav Husáek traveled to Moscow on the 23rd of August to insist Dubček and Černík should be included in a solution to the conflict. After days of negotiations, the Czechoslovak delegation accepted the Moscow Protocol, and signed their commitment to its 15 points. The protocol demanded the suppression of opposition groups, the full reinstatement of censorship, and the dismissal of specific reformist officials. It did not, however, refer to the situation in the CSSR as counter-revolutionary, nor did it demand a reversal of the post-January course. Reactions in Czechoslovakia. Popular opposition was expressed in numerous spontaneous acts of non-violent resistance. In Prague and other cities throughout the Republic, Czechs and Slovaks greeted Warsaw Pact soldiers with arguments and reproaches. Every form of assistance, including the provision of food and water, was denied to the invaders. Signs, placards, and graffiti drawn on walls and pavements denounced the invaders, the Soviet leaders, and suspected collaborationists. Pictures of Dubček and Svoboda appeared in the streets. Citizens gave wrong directions to soldiers and even removed street signs. Initially, some civilians tried to argue with the invading troops, but this met with little or no success. After the USSR used photographs of these discussions as proof that the invasion troops were being greeted amicably. Secret Czechoslovak broadcasting stations discouraged the practice, reminding the people that pictures are silent. The protests in reaction to the invasion lasted only about 7 days. Explanations for the fizzling of these public outbursts mostly center on demoralization of the population, whether from the intimidation of all the enemy troops and tanks, or from being abandoned by their leaders. Many Czechoslovaks saw the signing of the Moscow Protocol as treasonous. Another common explanation is that, due to the fact that most of the society was middle class, the cost of continued resistance meant giving up a cushy lifestyle, which was too high a price to pay. The generalized resistance caused the Soviet Union to abandon its original plan to oust the first secretary. Dubček, who had been arrested on the night of the 20th of August, was taken to Moscow for negotiations. It was agreed that Dubček would remain in office, but he was no longer free to pursue the liberalization that he had before the invasion. On the 19th of January 1969, student Jan Palach set himself on fire in Wenceslas Square in Prague to protest the renewed suppression of free speech. Finally, on the 17th of April 1969, Dubček was replaced as first secretary by Gustav Husáek, and a period of normalization began. Pressure from the Soviet Union pushed politicians to either switch loyalties or simply give up. In fact, the very group that voted in Dubček and put the reforms in place were mostly the same people who annulled the program and replaced Dubček with Husáek. Husáek reversed Dubček's reforms, purged the party of its liberal members, and dismissed the professional and intellectual elites who openly expressed disagreement with the political turnaround from public offices and jobs. Reactions in other Warsaw Pact countries. Soviet Union. On the 25th of August, at the Red Square, 8 protesters carried banners with anti-invasion slogans. The demonstrators were arrested and later punished, as the protest was dubbed anti-Soviet. One unintended consequence of the invasion was that many within the Soviet state security apparatus and intelligence services were shocked and outraged at the invasion, and several KGB, GRU defectors and spies such as Oleg Gordievsky, Vasily Mitrokhin, and Dmitry Polyakov have pointed out the 1968 invasion as their motivation for cooperating with the Western intelligence agencies. Poland and the People's Republic of Poland. On 8 September 1968, Ryszard immolated himself in Warsaw during a harvest festival at the 10th anniversary stadium in protest against the Warsaw Pact's invasion of Czechoslovakia and the totalitarianism of the Stalinist government. Seeweek did not survive. Romania. A more pronounced effect took place in the Socialist Republic of Romania, which did not take part in the invasion. Nicolae Ceausescu was already a staunch opponent of Soviet influence and had previously declared himself on Dubček's side. Held a public speech in Bucharest on the day of the invasion, depicting Soviet policies in harsh terms. This response consolidated Romania's independent voice in the next 2 decades, especially after Ceausescu encouraged the population to take up arms in order to meet any similar maneuver in the country. He received an enthusiastic initial response, with many people, who were by no means communist, willing to enroll in the newly formed paramilitary Patriotic Guards. East Germany. In the German Democratic Republic, the invasion aroused discontent among those who had hoped that Czechoslovakia would pave the way for a more liberal socialism. However, isolated protests were quickly stopped by the Volkspolizei and Stasi. Albania responded in opposite fashion, already feuding with Moscow over suggestions that the country should focus on agriculture to the detriment of industrial development, and concerned that Moscow was becoming too liberal in its dealings with Yugoslavia. It withdrew from the Warsaw Pact entirely. Economic fallout from this move was mitigated somewhat by a strengthening of Albanian relations with the People's Republic of China, which was itself on increasingly strained terms with the Soviet Union.